It looks like there's like, I don't know. I won't say what it can be. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we give you thanks that you are always with us, that you lead and guide us. Be with us and in our conversation today, that all that we say and do may be to your glory, as we seek to understand how you are calling Trinity to be a ministry in this community and beyond. In Christ's name we pray, amen. And I believe Deb and Vicki are going to start with annual conference. Make sure you talk into the microphone. Or unless you want to come up here and do it.
Watch out for the space shuttle. It fell once during Bible school this week and scared us all to death. So hope that doesn't happen today. So if it does, Sean and Joe, I will need you to rescue me.
Oh, if it's action, don't worry.
Yes. Good morning. For those of you who may not know me, my name is Deb Jolly. And I was one of your 3 lay delegates to the South Carolina Annual Conference this year. It was myself, Vicki Harvey, and Steve Whitaker. And this was my first time, so I was a newbie. And I didn't know exactly what to expect, but I was pleasantly surprised and pleased. Attending annual conference has been a lifelong desire of mine. I grew up in youth councils and the state youth council and jurisdictional youth council, and so a desire has always been as an adult to be able to do that same type thing within our faith and our conference, and I was finally able to have that dream come true for me, and it was an honor to be able to serve our church in this way. From the processional of our opening service on Sunday night, to the ordination service, to the business meetings, to the final prayer on Wednesday as we departed, I was in awe as to how our United Methodist faith goes about its mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. I am here today just to bring you an update of all who have been members or have been connected to our church in some way. And first of all, Reverend Michelle Cockcroft has been reassigned to Trinity, so she will be with us for another year. And so and we, Steve, Vicki, and I, saw Paul and Jan on Sunday night. Just as soon as we walked in to the conference, there were Jan and Paul, and they're doing great. They look great, and they're still living in the Columbia area where they retired to. We saw Sissy and Steve Holler, and I didn't even recognize Steve Holler. They have been reassigned to their church in Rock Hill and will be going back to Rock Hill for another year. But Steve now looks like Santa Claus with a big, bushy, white beard. So I asked him if we had anything for the kids this coming Christmas, would he please come and be Santa Claus for us? And he said, sure. I saw Neil. Nobody else saw Neil. You did? Okay, well, Steve nor Vicki saw him, but I saw him, and he's doing great, happy as he can be, and he has been reassigned to Lancaster. And I spoke with several of his members whom Sam Wood, that grew up here in Trinity, Colonel Wood's son, Sammy, I knew him as Sammy, and his wife, who was my best friend going through high school, go to his church. And they all just love him down there, and they were excited that he was coming back. Heather and Brian Humphreys, we saw them, and they're both doing great, and they're both reassigned to the Spartanburg area again also. Let's see. And I don't know how many of you remember Dr. John Wood Robinson and Carol Linda when they were here at Trinity, but each year they go through a memoriam of anybody who has had a spouse or a minister within the conference. They do a memorial to them, and Carol Linda had a memorial this year, and they were here back in the late 60s, early 70s. And for those of you who don't know, our children's wing here is dedicated in both of their honors. And so she did pass away this past year. Then we go on to the retirees, and Scott Petrie, as many of you will remember, or some of you as I look out over the congregation, Scott Petrie was an associate minister here, his first appointment after his ordination, and he was here with us for 4 years, I think, and he retired this year. Our own Beth Burgess Drennan, who grew up in this church, I grew up with her. She was married in this church, and she has been a minister and is retiring. And she and her husband live in Rock Hill, and that's where she's serving her last appointment, and they're going to be staying in Rock Hill. But she said she hopes to get down here to Trinity soon to be able to see people and just to get reacquainted with Trinity again. Then we had a member of our congregation who was elected to the Wofford College Board of Trustees, Jim Switzer. So whenever you see Jim, let's congratulate him, and we're very fortunate to be able to have somebody from our church in this type of position. Now, I have saved the best for last, and that is Reverend John Sterling Poole. He grew up in this church, and he's delivered many sermons in this church as a youth, and it was obvious that he was being called into the pastorship because has always been great. He is appointed by the conference as the director of the Charleston Wesley Foundation, and he was licensed on Monday night to be a local pastor. So that is his first step in his ordination process, and we should be so very proud. And he also got up at conference and spoke one time, and he was just very, very good. And hopefully one day he might be back in this pulpit with us, and I'll get to congratulate him. I ask you all, as we go through this next year, to remember our mission statement as United Methodists. The mission of the United Methodist Church is to make disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world by proclaiming the good news of God's grace and by exemplifying Jesus' command to love God and neighbor, thus seeking the fulfillment of God's reign and realm in the world. Thank you.
I
couldn't stand up there with my microphone and my papers and all this other stuff because I wanted to be sure. My part today is presenting the resolutions that were voted on, not voted on, how it was presented at conference. The first resolution presented at conference was opposing the death penalty, and it passed with pretty much no discussion or anything like that, and it passed there. The next one was the gun violence resolution. It passed, but it was a lot of debate. There was some language in it that people did not like, but what it is asking us to do is the gun violence resolution, which passed, encouraged United Methodists to address the epidemic of gun violence and to prayerfully address gun violence in their local context. So that's what we narrowed it down to. It was not, there was some things in there, but that's what that was what was voted on and passed. The next resolution, there were 4. These 4 resolutions were presented by the Reconciling Ministries Network of South Carolina. They were presented, there was no name attached to it, no person's name attached to it. It was put in by the committee itself. When they did that, it was brought up, Standing Rule 70 could not be taken from an organization that was not recognized as part of the Methodist Conference. So it was ruled out of order. So those 4 resolutions that were up from the Reconciling Ministries were not voted on at all. But a silver lining did come out of that situation. On the next day of conference, Dr. Roger Gramlin proposed a motion to ask the Standing Rules Committee to consider Standing Rules 70 before, amending Standing Rule 70 before annual conference of 2024, authorizing the conference secretary and parliamentarian to review all submitted resolutions to determine if they are properly before the annual conference for consideration. If not, Gramlin's motion mentioned that they would advise the resolution committees that the deadline for the resubmission of corrected versions would be extended to March 25th. If there was a second, and that motion passed. So that helped out with the standing rules and also with people putting in for resolutions at the conference. So that was a positive that came out of them calling our resolution from the South Carolina Reconciling Ministry Network out of order. So I was trying to find a word to describe the feeling. Michelle and I couldn't really come up with a word. We were talking about it. It was, you could feel it on the floor. It was tension, there was tension, and there was also anticipation, because they did not give out the final resolution from the Board of Trustees until lunchtime, and we voted that afternoon. So we did not know until then which churches in the conference were going to be officially disaffiliated with our church and with our conference. And so and they finally gave them out right before lunch and adjourned, and then we came back and we voted on the resolution. It came from the Board of Trustees because the Board of Trustees of the South Carolina Annual Conference handles those type of situations with property and monies and that sort of thing. There were 113 churches that met the disaffiliation process for this year, and those voted on. Of the 113 churches, there were 112 predominantly white churches and only one black church that came through on the 113. Spartanburg District had 12 churches to disaffiliate. And then we also had 2 churches that closed. The 2 churches that closed were Unity, United Methodist Church in Union, and the other church that closed was Lockhart United Methodist Church. they both were down to 3 or 4 members. And so they felt at this time that they would close the church. If you are interested and want to know those churches that closed, there's a listing on the conference website. We have a few up here, or we can get you another copy of those. But all the stipulations that were set up by the conference and according to the Book of Discipline were followed by these 113 churches. It was a sad time when this was passed and read. There was not very much discussion on it. It was a lot of prayer. A lot of prayer was offered up before we voted and after we voted. And it was probably, I've been going to conference and representing Trinity for several years and also been attending as a PK, and basically all my life I've been going back and forth with conference, but this had to be one of the saddest times that I have ever seen. And our bishop cried. And we cried. Because I feel like we have lost some of that. We've lost a lot with us not being able to be in connection with these persons, but they felt like that it was time for them to leave. And I felt like some of the churches left for other reasons besides what a lot of people are hearing on the news. It was not just the human sexuality of it. It was other issues as well. And I felt that was having some things to go with it. But the other afternoon, Paul Harmon has a website, and he had this up. And I want to read it to you as I end this. When we question God's reason for allowing injustice, we are asking the wrong question. Instead of asking, why does God allow this to happen, we should ask, how should I respond? What can I do to help those who are suffering? And that was kind of how we ended on that note with that. It was a sad time. And like I said, we do have a list of those if you want. And the Advocate was a great source also for the listing of the details of the resolutions. We also passed the budget. It was a 10% across the board reduction, 10 to 12% across the board reduction, because we just don't know exactly where our monies are going to be standing at this time. So they did reduce our budget, and it was voted on. Was there any discussion on that pretty much, or they just explained it? I don't think there was a lot of discussion. Yeah.
And said that it was a shot in the dark because they didn't know.
Yeah, the budget is kind of more of a shot in the dark because we really don't know exactly, how we're going to come out of this as far as the monies are concerned. So
that's actually when John got up and spoke.
Yeah.
His budget has been cut by 15%.
Yeah.
He said, I can reach 5 colleges without.
John, that's when John Poole spoke up. That was right. He spoke up on behalf of the Wesley Foundations in the Charleston area because that's what his assignment is. So I think some of us are going to have to step up a little bit and some of our agencies and things that may have been affected by this. But we will plow on. We need to ask how we can help and how can we respond to this. Do I have any questions about any of this that was with the resolutions or anything? Yes, Susan?
Did any churches apply for this affiliation that did not qualify?
We did not get that. We did not receive that information. I had heard that there were several, just by the grapevine and listening to other people talk. It was kind of that. I heard that there were several who did not meet the qualifications, and most of it had to do with the money. I think Michelle's going to address that. I know somebody. Okay, that's fine. Well, that's fine. Okay, I'm good.
Any other questions?
Any other questions about that? But yeah, I'm sure there were, or decided that they could not meet the qualifications of this, because there are qualifications they had to meet before they could be disclosed.
So before Ryan and Terry get stand up, just to give a really brief history of why there is this disruption in our denomination. In the question of how to be in ministry with people of the LGBT plus community has been a struggle and a question and a battle within our conference for 50 years. It's not a new issue. It's been a conversation that the United Methodist Church has had since 1972. If you know your Methodist history, you know that we became United Methodist in 1968. So it's not a new issue, a new concern. In General Conference 2016, the bishops asked for the General Conference to create a commission on the way forward that would look at how the United Methodist Church can go forward. They created that commission. They had a special called conference in 2019 where that commission presented options. There were 3 primary options presented. I believe that there were a total of 5, but there were 3 primary. What they thought would pass did not. Something else passed. What is called the Traditionalist Plan passed. Also out of that 2019 General Conference, they created a pathway for churches to disaffiliate. That relates to how the conferences respond or deal with LGBT plus persons, whether it be clergy or married individuals in the church. So South Carolina, our bishop said South Carolina has not violated the discipline. No one in South Carolina, no minister in South Carolina has married a same-sex couple that anybody's aware of, and the annual conference has not commissioned or ordained an individual who is self-professes. So our bishop said South Carolina churches could not use that new paragraph, which is 2553. You'll hear that 2553. South Carolina churches could not use that paragraph to disaffiliate unless they were progressive churches who wanted changes that were more progressive, and the church has remained traditional, quote unquote. So that pathway was set forward. South Carolina churches couldn't leave unless they were progressive using that pathway. There were churches who wanted to leave regardless, even though the language remained conservative, remained the traditional language in the Book of Discipline. Traditional churches wanted to disaffiliate. That's when the conference trustees came up with another plan that Terry's going to talk about. And that's where we are today. And Terry's going to talk about the plan.
Okay, and I am, privy to some of the information as your lay leader, and having been included in some meetings and things that came about as a result of this plan that the bishop and folks, his trustees came up with for those churches who wanted to disaffiliate. This was late last year. Since the discipline is still traditional, and these churches that wanted to disaffiliate were themselves traditional, that's why the bishop was like, that doesn't fit with what the General Conference has come up with, so we need to have a plan for them to use in order to disaffiliate. So the plan that they came up with was very late in the year. Everything had to be finalized by the end of March, beginning of March 1.
Votes had to be by March 1.
Yeah.
It was disseminated like December 15th.
Yeah, and all this came out late December, right at Christmas time when there was so much going on, and it had to be completed by March 1. that it was a very rushed situation for the churches that were interested in disaffiliation. But what had to happen was that there had to be some groundswell of support for disaffiliation in a church, and then that would go to the church council. The church council would then approach the district superintendent, wherever that is, expressing that church's interest in disaffiliation. This process is really called discernment. The desire of the bishop and the trustees were that churches would go through a period of reflection and a period of discernment to determine whether or not they could continue in mission and ministry. That's the point. Can the church continue in mission and ministry? Because that's what we're all about, is fulfilling that mission of making disciples for Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. If the church went through the discernment period of 30 days and prayerfully determined that they could not continue as a United Methodist Church, then there were criteria that they had to meet. Those had to be worked on during that 30 days. Because the churches are all connected and tied together financially through the conference, there were financial obligations that had to be met. A church that is disaffiliating had to have paid all of the previous year's apportionments, would be required to pay a prorated amount of this year's apportionments up to the time of conference. They had to pay 10% of the assessed valuation of all of their property, their church, building, parsonage, whatever else they might own. There were several financial obligations that had to be met, some related to unfunded pension through the conference. So there was a lot of that would have to be going on at the same time that this 30-day discernment period was happening. One of the things that a lot of folks don't understand about this process, about this discernment process that they came up with, is that it can happen in any year. You know, we were talking about this year, churches that felt an urgency to disaffiliate this year at annual conference. But there is no sunset on this process, so it can happen next year if a church decides they want to disaffiliate, or the next year if a church decides that they want to disaffiliate. It just has to take place by March 1st of that calendar year in which they want to disaffiliate, because some work then has to be done prior to annual conference in order for them for it to be voted upon. So, once that 30-day discernment period is over, and once that church has decided that they can meet those requirements that are set forth in the provision, then they get together, they have a meeting with the district superintendent, and they must inform, or make every effort to inform every member about the date of the meeting and the time so that they can be there. Doesn't matter if they're all there or not. It takes a two-thirds vote of all of those present at that meeting for them to disaffiliate. So a vote is only called for at the end of a discernment process, which would be initiated when there was a feeling in this church enough for the church council to enter into a period of discernment. Because we've heard, some of us have heard folks say, well, when are we going to vote? Like, well, you don't vote unless you are in this period of discernment. You know, at the end of this period of discernment is when a vote would be called for, and you would only enter that period of discernment if there was some movement within the church that was the direction you wanted to go. And so that's why that hasn't happened at Trinity, because we haven't had brought to church council a desire on the part of a bunch of people, of multiple folks, that we do that. So we have been in a wait and see how this is all going to turn out with annual conference, with general conference, next general conference, and all of those kinds of things, and have not had any push to enter into a period of discernment. So that answers that question about the whole voting thing. Anything else I left out about that process?
As Terry said, the process in South Carolina does not have a sunset date. And what some of the fear is, in some churches has been that paragraph 2553 that is from the General Conference that other annual conferences are using has a sunset date of December 31st, 2023. That's why some churches were rushing. Most of the churches, or many of the churches who separated this year, like my home church, they've been prepared for 10 years. I mean, they've been preparing, they've been saving the money, putting the money aside for whatever it ended up being. So most of those churches had already been in this process of discernment and preparing and getting ready for the separation. But the paragraph that the South Carolina Conference is using, the trustees are using, does not have a sunset date on it.
I just think it's been sad to see the Methodist Church being torn apart by anything, by any issue. But I've been pleased at how our leadership, our bishop and our district superintendent in the meeting that was held to bring all of the disaffiliation process to the churches, they were totally focused on mission and ministry. It wasn't about anything controversial. It was about, can your church continue mission and ministry? Let's keep that in mind as we go forward, that's really what the bottom line is for all of this and for us at Trinity. All right, thank you.
All right, so what next? Where does the United Methodist Church, and where does Trinity go from here? And while I know a lot of us are sitting here a bit anxious and perhaps nervous, and concerned, just take a breath, right? Because I don't know. Nobody does, and it's okay. But what I know is that we'll work through this together. All right, we're going to be compassionate with one another. We're going to love one another. Sean pointed out that the slide would have been a lot better had the music worked. Similarly, this place is a lot better with all of us. That's what makes it a great place. So, and that's what makes people want to come here. I'm sure that there are things that, if I were to poll each of us individually, I'm sure that there are things that you would like to see changed in the United Methodist Church. I'm sure that there have been things that you'd like to see changed for the United Methodist Church since there's been a United Methodist Church. And no matter what happens next year, I'm sure there will still be things that you'd like to see changed in the United Methodist Church. So let's be real wary about letting things that we might like to see changed divide us apart to the point that we can't act collectively. I shared this the other day with Michelle and Terry and Vicki and Deb and Steve. I read a book recently by the biologist E.O. Wilson, who's a longtime biologist professor at Harvard. And he is he's an atheist. In part of the reason, at least I suspect, that he's an atheist is that I think he's on one step. You see, he's an evolutionary biologist. He recognizes that what makes human beings the dominant species on the planet is our ability to operate in a cooperative manner. Right? There's a reason that we as human beings are able to hunt and kill lions long before rifles were ever invented. We work together. And when we work together, we accomplish great things. Now, I think his problem with religion, this is E.O. Wilson's, is that all too often it becomes a division point, right? Whether it's Christianity and Islam or any other religion, whether it's various denominations or sects within religion, think the wars that we see in the Middle East, whether it's even Methodists fighting over what our book of discipline is going to say. When we allow that to divide us, we really take away that which is most beautiful and wonderful about our species and what's made us the dominant species, because we are not the biggest, strongest, and fastest, and we will never be the biggest, strongest, and fastest. Our superpower, if you will, is that we work together. And when we let things steal that from us, at least in my view, that's sort of like spitting in the face of God, because that's what He gave us. That's the gift. That's what makes us special. So, where do we go from here? I don't know what's going to happen between now and next year. But I do know this, right? Roughly 115 churches, 113 churches left. And there will be some, I'm sure, that will enter this discernment process between now and next year. I think a lot of this, at least my perception of it, is that people are, as Michelle commented about her home church, people are positioning themselves to be where they want to be, expecting something to happen next year. That seems a bit silly to me, right? Until you know what happens next year, you make that decision then. What I'd like to see us do, and what I intend to do with church council when we meet in 2 weeks, is to establish what I'm going to, I'm creating this, good, bad, or indifferent, naming it what I want to name it. And it's going to be the Committee on Understanding. And this is not going to be an advocacy organization. This is going to be a committee that's based off reporting. And what I anticipate is going to happen in May, so May of next year, May of 2024, General Conference, which as you all know is the global United Methodist Church, gets together and votes on what its rules are going to be, what its book of discipline may or may not say. And I anticipate that there will be some slew of resolutions that will address the unity of the church, that will address what the book of discipline may say. And it will just be a lot of these things that are going to be drivers of the vision. But I'd like for this group, this Committee of Understanding, to report to the church, to Trinity, on what these various proposals are. That way, if you individually, or ultimately if we as a church decide that we want to act as an advocate, you can reach out to your delegates and say, hey, for these reasons, I'd like to see you vote for this. Or this is what we're praying for as far as your guidance and wisdom as you meet. This group will be a small group. I don't know that it needs to be a large group, because ultimately what they're going to be doing is researching, finding out what's been proposed, and just sharing facts. So I would think that a group of 3 to 5 could effectively do that without creating too high of a burden on folks, but also being a manageable number. Admittedly, I'd like to see people on each side of the theological debate as it relates to a change of the book of discipline involved in the committee, because I'd like to make sure that there's some agreement on what it is that's been proposed and what that means. And also, I think it gives us an opportunity to show how we can ultimately really continue to work together on this. So, if you'd like to serve on the Committee of Understanding, give me a phone call. My phone number is 704-576-3472. It's available through the bulletin or church office. My email address is regaylord@gmail.com. So reach out to me there. If you're sitting in the church right now, you're on the short list. was going to tell you. Congratulations. You volunteered with your feet. But, you know, this morning as I was listening to our hymn, the line, cure thy children's warring madness. I think we as human beings often have this attraction to conflict and dispute, and it's interest, it's an intrigue, you know, as the newspaper folks say, if it bleeds, it leads. Sometimes boring's good, just boring old cooperative, ho-hum, doing our work, making this world a little bit better place, making the United Methodist Church a little bit better place, making Trinity United Methodist Church in Spartanburg a little bit better place, one day at a time. I told a group of young men week before last who joined me for a wrestling camp. They had never wrestled before, and I said, listen, I don't need you to be a world champion next week. I don't need you to be a world champion tonight. I don't need you to be a state champion tonight. I just need you to give yourself time and space to get better, which means that you're going to make mistakes. And I just need you at the end of each rep to get that much better. And if you'll get that much better, we'll improve a great deal. So, I'm sure I've made a load of mistakes this morning. I'm sure that we've made some mistakes in the past, and I'm sure we'll make some mistakes in the future. But I'm more than willing to listen to you, as is, I'm quite confident, all of Church Council. We're here to commune together to try to make this a better place as best we can figure out how. So, again, Committee on Understanding, if you're willing, if you're interested in doing that research and trying to help try to learn about what various resolutions may be appointed at the General Conference, in essence, help us understand what are our options, right? I don't really like the idea that, seemingly, as you hear reported, like, well, you've got this option, you've got this option. This world's a whole lot broader than that. So I'd like for all of us to be able to be really informed. And so what I envision this group would do is that you would do the research, look at what the various proposals are, help summarize them, help report them through the church bulletin, or the church newsletter and or the church bulletin, and maybe even some kind of bi-monthly, monthly to quarterly announcement here, just so we know. I feel like there's some concern because there's just so much noise. And at least just having information and feeling confident about what it is you know will help give some peace and help us act from a place of wisdom rather than a place of just reaction. So, that's generally my goals for us. Largely where Church Council is. We at this point have not felt some groundswell of interest in leaving the United Methodist Church at Trinity. And therefore we have not called on any vote. Largely because my view of the vote is you vote if you call the vote if you feel like there's a lot of people that want to leave. And I don't get that sense when I speak to people, when I see you. And I've not had anybody say, hey, I think that we do have a bunch of people that want to leave. You're welcome to talk to me at any time about any of this. All right, feel free to call, feel free to email. I will probably try to call you back because a 15-minute phone call can be about a 4-hour email session. Just want to make sure that if you have questions that they're resolved, and of course if you want to present questions, we've talked about if you have questions, feel free to present them through the church office. You can present them with your name, you can present them without your name. As we get questions, what we'd like to do is just provide information. So we might put in the church newsletter a list of questions received and responses to them without names. I think if we work together, I see Evelyn back there, and I'm reminded that we're on the cusp of 100 years of Trinity. While I won't be here, and probably none of us will be here. I see Nora over there, she's got a chance at it. Maybe Bennett. But it'd be cool for there to be a Trinity in 100 years, in another 100 years. And for this not just to be some empty building or something that's been torn down for space and conference heights. But that's only going to happen if we work together, right? If we start dividing and making this place less than what it can be, it won't be here. It won't be here in 10 years, much less 100. Okay? Thank you.
Are there any questions that you want to bring forward now?
Are there any churches that left because they felt that the current policies were too conservative?
Not that I'm aware of. The churches that I know of, I believe 2. Oh, so Judy asked, are there any churches that left because they felt that the policies were too conservative? Not that I'm aware of. I know of a couple of churches who have expressed a commitment to be welcoming and affirming of the LGBT plus community, regardless of what happens. So, but those churches have not left.
Help me get this timeline straight. When is the general conference going to vote on, I'm assuming it would be a change in the book of discipline, if that's brought up. Is that correct?
So the next general conference is May of next year, May 2024. It's going to be in Charlotte. It is the postponed 2020 conference. The bishops are also asking, so they're asking for a conference, a general conference in 2026 to basically catch up. So there may be changes in the discipline in 2024. We don't know, because there'll be all kinds of resolutions, but what happened in 2019, the resolution that they thought had the biggest backing, that they thought was most likely to pass, did not pass. So it's impossible to say exactly what will happen in 2024. There's talk based on the idea that you have, because you do have some of the conservative churches leaving, so that will change the dynamic.
How are we dealing with the delegates that churches left?
If the churches that left, if they had delegates that had been elected to general or jurisdictional conference, then those delegates would no longer be eligible to go. With the clergy delegates, none of those are in churches that left. We lost one of our general conference delegates because Robin Deese was elected bishop. So one of our jurisdictional clergy delegates moved up to be a general conference clergy delegate, and one of the alternates moved up to be a jurisdictional, because there will also be a jurisdictional conference next year following general conference. Among the laity, if they belong to a church that leaves the annual conference and they leave with the annual conference, or they leave with that church, they would not be eligible to be a lay delegate. I know of one that I suspect, but I have not heard definitively. And so it would just be that the alternates would move up. Because they did not elect new delegates. So my guess is that there were none, or there were enough in reserve, enough alternates to move up to take the places of any that may be leaving. We may find out something before May, if that's different. But the clergy delegates, I know that all the clergy delegates were staying UMC.
The churches that left, 113, 14, where's the minister pool for those churches now?
So the churches that left, where are those ministers? Is that what you're asking?
Now, where will they get their ministers from?
That's up to them.
So they're not part of the conference?
They're no longer part of the conference. So the majority of the churches that left, their pastors left with them. I found a study on Lewis Center, which is associated with Wesley Seminary, and they did a study of the churches that have left through 2022, like nationwide, looking at who was leaving, the clergy that were leaving, the clergy that were leading the churches that were leaving. And most of the churches that are leaving, the clergy do go with them. There are some where the church leaves and the clergy stays UMC. Those clergy are put into the regular tenancy system that we're already a part of, and they just get a new appointment. If a church leaves, then that church has to find their own pastor. I know I heard from a friend whose husband is a district superintendent in another district, and after they had some kind of meeting, like discernment, or I don't know if it was the discernment, if it was the vote, and a church had decided to leave, to separate, the members of that group turned around and looked at the district superintendent and said, well, when will we hear about our new pastor? And he's like, I have no idea. That's not my job for you anymore. Because those churches are no longer part of the South Carolina Annual Conference. Now, whether they join another body, like if they join the Wesleyan Church, if they join the Global Methodist Church, if they join the Nazarene, I mean, there's all kinds of other denominations they can join. If they join one of those denominations, it will be however that denomination appoints, calls, or whatever. Does that answer the question? Anything else?
Michelle, I don't think a lot of people in this church understand what the total Methodist Church does for us. I've been involved with them for years, and they do a wonderful job. And UMCOR does a lot for this world. So there's a lot of things that the Methodist Church does through this chain that other churches, when they just big, won't have anything to do with it. So I think it's inherent on us to realize how much the Methodist Church means to us.
So to remember and to keep in the forefront of our minds because the Methodist Church is a connectional church. We are connected not only to the churches in our district and in our state, which is our conference, but we're connected to United Methodist Churches nationwide and worldwide. And one of the things that George is pointing to is, for example, UMVM, which is United Methodist Volunteers in Mission. It's groups that send mission groups to different locations, whether they be in the United States or worldwide. Like the earthquake in Haiti many years ago, a lot of United Methodist teams went to Haiti. UMCOR, which is United Methodist Committee on Relief, which is one of the general church agencies, is an organization that is one of the first organizations in any area of disaster. They go in, boots on the ground, working to help whatever is needed, usually with like rebuilding and cleaning and all that kind of stuff. But all of our churches, I mean, that's part of the beauty of the Methodist Church and being connected is we can do so much more connected. Because I can give $5 and my $5 can go, and that can only do so much. But if my $5 and your $5 and this $5 all come together, we can do so much more as the United Methodist Church. So even within the connection, just in South Carolina, we have agencies like Bethlehem Center that is part of the connection that helps in that community, but it's supported by the whole conference. We have Epworth Children's Home, which is supported by the churches of the conference. And most annual conferences have an Epworth Children's Home. Like North Carolina has an Epworth Children's Home. And that's what we all do together. As far as related to the clergy, when I think about those churches that are separated, there are some large churches that will probably be okay. But some of those smaller churches, did they really think about the fact that the conference is what helps them make sure they have insurance for their clergy? How are they going to be able to afford insurance for their clergy going forward? Are they going to have the financial resources? Because being connected to the conference, in some places, churches, we have what's called equitable compensation, so that there's a minimum salary that churches have to meet for clergy, and if they can't make it, they get kind of a grant from the conference. Well, those churches that are no longer part of the conference would not be eligible for that kind of grant from the conference. So we'll see how those churches deal with all that they'll have to deal with. At annual conference, somebody did ask the question, have you started thinking about what will happen if any of the churches that separated get out and decide that they don't like it out there and they want to come back into the conference? And the bishop said that the trustees, they're looking at what they would do and how they would approach that and how they would deal with that situation. Because I've heard through clergy groups that that's happened in other places, because there's other conferences that have had separations or disaffiliations since 2019, and the churches have come back and said, we won't back in. I don't know if that's true or not. That's just what I've heard. You know how you hear things in groups. So, and the same thing happens the same question goes for clergy. You have clergy that leave and then decide that maybe that was a mistake. We'll see how the conference and the Board of Ordained Ministry will be part of that conversation. Anything else? If you have a question but you don't want to say it out loud, I have some index cards. You can have an index card, write your question, bring it, or drop it by the church office, or drop it by my office, and we will get those questions answered. Some of them I may have to look up. I did a lot of research this week trying to figure out things. I have some information about, as far as United States wide, the number of churches that have left. I found information about the budget. So General Conference is already looking at the budget that they're proposing for next year. I believe is a 40% reduction. It's like the lowest budget since 1984. The South Carolina budget, it was a shot in the dark, because when they started doing the budget, working on the budget, they didn't know how many churches were disaffiliating and which churches. And so that's why it was kind of like, well, we're not really sure. But they did look at reducing the budget so that the apportionments of the churches that stayed would not, go up. They were trying to make sure that the churches maintained their previous apportionment levels. That it would only go up based on the normal calculation, which is based on your spending other than capital expenditures.
What's the total number of churches that stayed?
What's the total number of churches that stayed? Well, I think there's over 900 and less than 1,000 churches in South Carolina. I don't remember the exact number, so there's over 800, less than 900, I don't remember the number of. But it's like,
It was about 10% left.
yeah, about 10% left, and I think that like in other conferences they're seeing 10 and 12%. You have in a very high percentage in like one of the Texas annual conference. Texas has multiple annual conferences. One of the Texas annual conferences had like a 40 or 50% disaffiliation. That was a bishop tried to take the whole conference out, and Judicial Council said that that wasn't allowed. We don't have a mechanism to do that.
Michelle, there are 958. We have 113 churches comprised, and 12% of the 958 total churches in South Carolina.
So 958 remain.
No, it's 958.
So there were 958 total, 113 disaffiliated, a couple closed, and so there's 840 and change. So about 840-ish. And every year we have churches that close because of the churches just cannot sustain their ministries. They can't sustain paying for the buildings. Anything else? If you have any questions, just let me know. Thank you. Let us say a prayer before we go. Sorry, William. Gracious God, we give you thanks. We give you thanks that you are with us and that you lead and guide us in all that we do. Be with each of these persons. Take them into their day that they may see and share your glory. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.